He's in the meeting room. Why is Jameson in the bloody meeting room?
Oh, you don't know.
Hello, Jameson.
Hello, how are you?
I'm okay. How's things with you?
Oh, not too bad.
No Hector this evening?
He's in the hallway waiting for. He's on sort of lying in wait for anyone headed for the kitchen at this time of night.
Oh gosh, really?
It's dinner is in about an hour and a half. And,
Oh my God! So in other words, if we're not wrapped up fairly promptly, he'll be tearing the house down.
Well, Laura can always be persuaded, but
Yeah.
effectively, yeah, he's lying in wait to persuade anyone headed for the kitchen that they should.
Right. Okay, that sounds fair enough then. That sounds fair enough.
He's out there somewhere.
Cool. So just waiting for Louis.
Yep.
And also Elliot Clark, who can help out in a background capacity, including acting as security in terms of monitoring the audience.
Yeah, I imagine we'll be all safe enough on that front.
Yeah, I mean, there's only two people who are on this Zoom call who I don't know their background.
Yeah.
In other words, they've come from somewhere which I don't know. They've seen it on Twitter or something like that. The rest are either associated with the university or veterans groups, or other universities beyond Plymouth, or the Marine Institute in particular. So we shall see. We shall see who comes.
Great. Well, what level of introduction are you, sharing really, are you looking for? So taking questions at the end as well?
Yeah, I think so. In other words, if you do a kind of general introduction to the event, I mean, in a way, what needs to be said is that, you know, it's 40 years since the Falklands. It's 40 years to the day since HMS Sheffield was sunk with a loss of 20 seamen on board. So for those people who the phrase goes, went south in 1982, this is a particularly poignant day. This is the point where Britain began to lose serious numbers of people in terms of the Falklands. And in remembering and commemorating the Falklands 40 years on, what we're doing at the university through this event is we're trying to do something slightly different. That essentially what we're doing here is, rather than deal with the military aspects of the campaign, we're looking at some of the political aspects of the campaign that, generally speaking, tend to get, in terms of commemoration at least, get largely overlooked, because the emphasis understandably is on the military stuff. So we're dealing with the politics of the Falklands War, essentially. So we're trying to do something a bit different so we don't tread on anybody's toes. And actually, given the number of veterans who are actually sort of on this call, and indeed the children of veterans, that's actually a really sensible thing that we actually did there, I think. So we don't tread on anybody's toes. Does that seem okay?
Absolutely. So I'm just I'm writing notes.
Yeah. So yeah, we're trying to do something slightly different to what's being done elsewhere, which is an awful lot of stuff, which has been done largely on the military level. So we're trying to do something slightly different. So if you give the general level of introduction, then sort of hand over to me, and I shall go into PowerPoint mode and do the presentation, and then on to Louis and deal with his. If we get Elliot to monitor questions which are coming up in the chat room, and then he can feed them through to you as chair at the end to say, you know, here's an interesting question, here's an interesting question. So you've actually got a list of questions which are sort of coming in your direction, and you can simply pose them to us. There's no particular reason why we have to end at 8:15. Although if Hector wants his dinner, we may not be able to stop it. I mean, in a way, the only other kind of points of issue is how we actually handle the questions. Do we actually allow the speaker to ask the questions themselves? Or are we going to literally allow you to put it? So are you the kind of master of ceremonies, or are you the kind of voice of the questioner? And whether or not we allow people to have their Zoom cameras on. I don't know whether you've got any thought on that issue.
Well, you've suggested there's no particular reason to worry about anyone sort of being troublesome. So I don't see a big problem on the cameras front.
Okay.
With the best will in the world, I'm with a non professional group, I would tend to ask for the questions in the chat. Just not that I'm expecting trouble, but I might be expecting long-windedness.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
That sort of just more of a comment than a question can really go awry when there's also sort of a strong oral history element.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good point, actually. So we'll get the questions to come through you then, courtesy of Elliot feeding through to you. So if you also announce that, you know, if you've got particular questions, by all means ask them during the presentations, and we will bank them at the end. Or if at the end you've got questions, well, we can do that too. Does that seem reasonable?
It does.
Good. Oh, hang on. I'm getting 1 or 2 pings here. Does this mean particular? Oh no, that's all good. Oh, hang on. It's all right. Connor Hipkiss wants to come along, so I'll give him a helping hand with that. Sent items. Forward to Connor Hipkiss. Yeah, we will have 1 or 2 third years in particular in this. So Australian Michael wants to come along. And James Allen wants to come along. So, and now Connor Hipkiss. So we will have we'll have some of our students as well as some postgrads as well. Got at least a couple of postgrads coming along to this now. No. All right. Okay, so find the Zoom call again. Okay, cool. Yeah. Everything all right? Any other issues?
Not really. It's all at the moment. We're just trying to pick our way through the archives and heritage thing.
Yeah, that's less than brilliant.
Well, a bad recruiting year would really solve several problems for us.
Yeah, it would make it simple, wouldn't it?
It would make it very simple, because the great challenge is none of us wants to run the program ourselves.
Yeah,
because none of us are really experienced in the field. At the same time, I don't want to devote this new hire to hiring an archivist specialist and then have the program go away in 18 months.
No, that could be awkward, couldn't it? Yeah. Oh, hang on. It's all right. Just something slightly strange happened. Oh,
there you go.
Oh, right. I don't know what happened there. Okay, cool.
I imagine you were setting up the security.
I was just trying to, yeah.
Yeah.
How can we do security and not mute you?
Well, if you set it up now, you'll be all right. It's just it blanket mutes everyone, and then you can select people to unmute.
Right. Do you know how to do that? Because I've actually given you sort of co-hosting.
Okay.
Co-hosting.
Well, then let me me see. I don't seem to have the security. There we are. Settings might be. I'm not sure if I do have the security bar at the bottom.
So what's it under? Hello, Elliot. Oh,
It's usually along the bottom next to the around the participants.
okay. So
Um,
I'm not seeing that, which is a bit weird. Oh, security. Wait a minute. Okay. Allow
And then you can-
participants to unmute themselves. All right.
we usually don't allow that because we can unmute someone if they wish to speak, but
Okay. So that is not ticked, so people cannot unmute themselves. Wait a minute.
yes,
Right.
exactly. They can speak when called upon.
Yeah, Elliot, try. Oh, that's better. Elliot's there now. Okay, cool. We're there. So we only need to enable Louis, and we're done. Okay, that's
Well,
good.
and take a look in the security settings about make sure the chat is active,
Okay.
because you can turn the chat off as well.
No, that's on. That's on.
Good. Right.
Okay, cool. We're there. Okay, Elliot. So what we're going to do is, if you can monitor any questions that are coming in, and just check nobody's doing anything crazy, and feed the questions through to Jameson. Yeah.
I will also be able to see them, so it's not like you need to copy, paste, and email them to me. But if there's any particularly good or relevant ones.
Yeah. And just keep an eye on things, really, and that's it.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's as simple as anything. Cool. We're still missing Louis. We've got one person in the waiting room, but we should have people from everywhere from the United States through to Europe and indeed Hong Kong on this. So it is truly potentially an international audience, which is an interesting one. Cool. Oh, just time for Louis then. So I'm just propping myself up.
I'm still.
Oh, Chris. I don't know who Chris is. No doubt all will become apparent. No doubt also 30 seconds before the start, we'll get somebody messaging, I can't get in. Can I just share my screen 1 minute just to check it's all fine and dandy? Okay. Okay, does that look all right?
Yeah, see everything there.
Good. Okay, stop sharing for a minute. I'm glad we're not doing 2 of these like last year. That was a bit much in technical terms. When are the philanthropists playing down here again, Jameson?
Soon. Our next game is they're playing in Wembury tonight. And,
right.
Our next Sunday game is very close. It's at Mount Edgecombe.
All right.
And then I think we're on. The youth, basically, we've got slightly fewer home matches this year because the youth organization is booming.
Right.
So I mean, good news overall, but
yeah.
Tight on timings. We were meant to be out at Cheese Ring last week, but got rained off.
Oh right, which everybody was really devastated by. I'm absolutely sure.
Yeah.
The good old Cheese.
Arch enemies. But yeah, Mount Edgecombe on Sunday, so very very close to a home match.
So that's up near. Is that near the Barrow at Mount Edgecombe? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really just across the road from the stable set up there.
Yeah. So who are you playing?
Mount Edgecombe have a team,
Oh, right. Okay.
and it is mainly people based in Plymouth who take the ferry over to play every.
Oh, I see. It's not. Yeah.
But they're a friendly bunch, and we've known them a long time, and we frequently loan them players and borrow players from them.
Oh, I see.
So that'll be a pleasant one.
Who was that guy we knew?
Cricketer. I know. I was thinking there was a cricketer, wasn't there?
It was the guy with the lady who did the dogs.
Oh, the Griffins.
Griffin?
Possibly.
Somebody who's like a professional dog walker and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
Kathy Griffin.
Oh, right. They're really good, actually, just in case you ever need anybody in terms of cat sitting or.
Yeah, she was or maybe is the dog warden for Plymouth.
Oh, really? Yeah, yeah.
So
Interesting.
yeah. And she used to be a mainstay of the women's team at Plymouth.
Oh, did she? I didn't know that. That's interesting. Yeah, they've got some crazy, insane kids down here though now, just like off the scale of talented.
Well, that's it. It's we're being pushed out by an actual growth in
Yeah.
in youth participation in cricket.
Although last night the club was playing the university, and there was Oliver Briddock, which is good to see. He lasted about 3 balls. Yeah, it was something else.
Good. The university team have to play in Ernesettle, I think, most of the time.
Do they? They weren't bad. I mean, to give them their due, I mean, they scored 90 odd runs in a 2020 that Plymouth had run up 170 odd. But they had one very good opening batsman. He was pretty good. He scored about 40 odd, and the rest were contributing, odd bits and pieces. So it was certainly interesting. It was well worth watching anyway. Oh, is everybody going to leave it till the last minute?
Well, Louis certainly is.
I hope he's remembered. That would be. Can you do us a bit on Churchill, Elliot? Although there is a bit of Churchill in this, interestingly enough, because Lord Carrington was the last member of any of Churchill's governments to actually step down from politics. 1982 was the point at which that connection with the Churchill government was actually severed. And Carrington had 1 or 2 good stories about Churchill, actually.
I've just been in conversation this morning, actually, about one of the ICS talks which is coming up, which I might be participating in.
Oh, right. Who's that with? It's
with the International Churchill Society. They have some talks coming up, and I spoke with Justin last week as well, or I think it was last week, about giving a talk as part of my fellowship. They want me to come on and sort of talk about how the fellowship is supporting my thesis research and the research I'm going to be doing over the next couple of years, and sort of my aims with it, and will it be a future publication, etc.
Okay. Sounds good. When's that scheduled for?
They're hoping to do it in June, but we haven't got an actual date yet.
Right. Okay.
Originally, it was going to be an event where it was both myself and the fellow from Oxford as well. But after conversations, we've decided to do it as 2 separate events. So it sort of makes it easier with the Q&A at the end as well, because our topics are so different that they just wouldn't really correlate very well.
Yeah. Well, that sounds exciting and interesting.
Yeah, it should be good.
I'll just message the waiting room and just saying we'll let them in soon.
Yep, I've sent an email to Louis with the link in it.
Yeah, he did acknowledge he'd received the thing, unless he's masquerading on somebody else's name. Louise Clare, who you can see in the waiting room, she's a Manchester University postgrad, and she's working on the press during the Falklands period. So she's an interesting one. Come on, Louis, where are you? Oh,
And he's not hanging around the waiting room.
no. Oh, well, maybe his internet's gone down. Who knows? He's got a little while to sort it out anyway.
He's on his phone.
No.
Oh,
I trust Louis. Louis will be here. Louis will sort it.
okay.
I've gone on a few bike rides and walking on Dartmoor with Louis, and can't. Well, the last time we went up to Dartmoor, it was literally Louis had to run the last 100 meters beside the bus that was coming because he left that fine.
Oh my God! Right, okay.
So,
Oh well, he's got acres of time. Oh, Australian Michael's here.
I'm assuming that when the talks are getting placed at Jameson, you have access to the waiting rooms as well to be able to admit people in.
I believe so.
Yeah, I've made Jameson and Louis co-hosts. I tried to make you a co-host, but strangely, it kept coming up with a kind of Elliot Clark 10 or Elliot Clark 100.
Right.
And it was just like, there's just no finding you,
No.
which was a bit bizarre. Oh, Connor Hipkiss is here. So that's
I'm not sure if I do have the
all right.
volume. I've got. It's usually. I'm sorry. I'm using a different client for it this time because I'm at home. And usually it's under participants, and it is not in this instance.
Okay.
Um,
Well, I'll keep an eye on it anyway. Stuart Barnes. Yeah, I thought by making you both co-hosts, you just automatically come through the waiting room and it'd be like nothing there. But that's apparently not the case, which is slightly strange.
yeah. Well, and like I say, I'm not on the usual device, so that's not helping.
All right, Sarah Cairn, Stuart Barnes. No. Oh, James Smith's here. That's good. So James Smith is one of our ex-students. He's at King's College London. He's going to live tweet some of this stuff out as well. Through the King's College Corbett 100. What do you call it? Twitter feed.
Oh yes, because he did end up at King's, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Oh, hey, Louis! Louis popped up. Awesome. How you doing? How you doing, Louis?
Good evening. You're right.
Yes, all good. Do you want to explain to him what we're doing then, Jameson, or shall I do it?
Yep. No, happy to.
Okay.
So we are going to admit people in about 10 seconds because it is 7. I'm going to do a very brief introduction and introduce Harry. And then I'll introduce you briefly in the introduction, but then we'll go on to your paper. Questions are going to be taken from the chat, which Elliot and I will be keeping an eye on after both of you have presented. Besides that, I don't think there's any particular wrinkles to be looked at. We're going to be doing the questions in chat because otherwise this could, I think, get quite discursive, quite narrative. So we're going to try and help keep things to time by doing that way. Besides that, I don't think there's much to it.
Okay.
So I think feel free, Harry, to let people in.
I'll just check nobody's got any issues outside. No, that's okay. All right. So I'm just going to let everybody in and admit Here we go. Bang on time.
Thank you. Sorry, I put some tea down the wrong bit and had to do a bit of coughing. So I muted myself, and having done that, was stuck that way. I can see that Louis has a full co-hosting status, but I don't think Elliot and I have. So Louis, if you could just periodically check that no one's trapped in the Phantom Zone.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, Harry's presenting, and then Harry can do the same while you're talking. Right, well, welcome everyone. I don't know if there are people, Harry, still drifting in, or whether we've got who we're expecting.
There may be a few more. I was expecting at least 3 people, but with the peculiarities of the internet, where we've got a good crowd already.
Okay, I'm happy to filibuster for a minute or two. But welcome to our evening beyond the battlefront, Falklands 40 years on. I don't know how Harry vocalizes the Falklands plus 40 title we've adopted here, but one of our events 40 years after the Falklands conflict. We'll get going in a second, just giving people a minute to join us. We'll have the 2 papers with questions following both papers, not each paper, which will be collected via the chat function on here, and so you can bang them in as they occur to you or as a point arises. And Elliot and I will be keeping an eye on those to ask them to Harry and Louis at the end of the event. It would be useful if you could say to whom the question is directed. It may be obvious at the time, but at the end of the evening when we're reading them, it maybe won't be. I don't know. So that's how we'll do that. But there will be questions taken at the end, and so the chat will allow us to do that. Harry and Louis are both, I believe, presenting on the screen there. So I think you've both got PowerPoints of a nature. Yep. And no video or anything, I don't believe. No. Okay. So that's how the proceedings are going to run. Nothing terribly much to it. Unless Harry thinks there's value in holding on another minute, we might as well get underway.
I'd just give it another minute. We just had one or two more people join us, and we'll get underway.
Well, while we do that, Harry, are there any upcoming related things that we ought to bear in mind?
There is simply so much. The Falkland Islands government has done an absolutely barnstorming program of commemoration. There's literally events going on quite regularly, so do keep an eye on particularly the Falkland Islands government's representative in the United Kingdom's Twitter feed, because he's acting as something of a clearinghouse for Falklands commemoration. And also South Atlantic Medal Association. I mean, those people are doing some terrific work in terms of actually the process of commemoration. There is an awful lot, and plenty more events between now and I think technically even after the anniversary of the liberation of Port Stanley. I think there are actually going to be events going on into the autumn as part of the process of commemoration. So there's an awful lot as we remember the Falklands War of some 40 years ago, and especially poignant on today, the loss of HMS Sheffield with 20 lives. This was the point when the British public really did begin to understand the nature of the war in the South Atlantic, and that lives would be lost inevitably as part of the process of retaking the Falkland Islands. So today is a particularly poignant moment, and I think all of us can remember, and I can certainly remember watching those grainy images of a still burning HMS Sheffield in the South Atlantic, and thinking about what's transpired to the crew, and thinking about the dangers that would still face our seamen, Royal Fleet Auxiliary, Royal Navy, and indeed merchant seamen, together with those involved in the land campaign, including Royal Marines. So today is a particularly poignant moment at which to reflect. And with that, I think we've now got 21 people. That's about the number of people I was expecting. So we're ready when you are.
That's great. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Jameson Tucker. I'm the head of history here at Plymouth. And as you all know, this evening we are having one of our events thinking about and discussing 40 years since the Falklands conflict. As Harry has just said, 40 years today is the beginning of kind of a real intensification of the conflict. The sinking of the HMS Sheffield marks not a turning point, but a real important moment in the public understanding of the war, as well as its conduct. Plymouth is taking, as you would imagine, a particular interest in the commemoration of the Falklands War. It's not just home to a sizable Navy presence, but also to thousands of sailors, Marines, and soldiers, as well as the dockyards themselves, which in the run-up to the departure of the fleet did so much to outfit the ships, supply the ships. And so thousands of workers in Plymouth had a hand in all of this, as well as it's being home to the families of a great many of the people who went out as well. So Plymouth has a number of facets, some of which we'll be covering here and some of which we'll be covering in future commemorations. So there's lots being done, especially really ramping up the last couple of weeks for the 40th anniversary of the Falklands. A lot of this is, as you would expect, with a strong focus on the military aspects of the conflict, everything from narrative histories to military and war studies, evaluations of what happened. Tonight's event does something a little different. It takes two of our modern historians and is getting them to look at some political aspects of the war. We're going to hear from Dr. Harry Bennett, who is Associate Professor in History here at Plymouth. He's going to be talking about the invasion of the Falkland Islands and the resignation of Lord Carrington. And then he's going to be followed by Dr. Louis Hillwood, the Philip Nicholas Truss Lecturer in Maritime History here at Plymouth, talking about Britain, the United States, and the struggle for the Falkland Islands. And so they're going to run one after the other, as I said, with questions coming at the end. But put the questions as they occur to you into the chat, and Elliot and I, Elliot's one of our PhD students in 20th century history, will be sort of collating them, reading them, and suggesting some to Louis and Harry to deal with at the end of the talk. So really good to see so many people here and to hear from Harry and Louis on this. And the next step, of course, is to ask Harry to take the stage, launch his presentation, and tell us about the resignation of Lord Carrington and the one of these initial outcomes of the invasion of the Falkland Islands on British politics.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up, or yeah, okay, we look good to go on that particular score. So the invasion of the Falkland Islands, the resignation of Lord Carrington. What is this paper based upon? Well, it's based upon the contemporary press, but it's also based upon an interview with Lord Carrington that I did many years ago in the House of Lords. He was gracious enough to accord me his time in talking through the process of resignation over the Falkland Islands. And it's also based upon a sizable amount of correspondence which I engaged with, involving those people who had been Conservative back or front benchers in 1982. I did this research originally in the 1990s. Unfortunately, there were enough senior Conservatives still around who were only too happy to respond to my questions about how they saw the Falklands conflict, and indeed how they saw Lord Carrington and what had transpired in terms of his foreign policy. Indeed, some of them were, shall we say, only too ready to engage their thoughts and send them in my direction, including in at least 2 cases, shall we say, correspondence which was anonymously directed to me by MPs unknown, who certainly had, shall we say, strong views on Lord Carrington. It's also based as well upon my memories of 1982. I will add at this point that I was at school in 1982. One always in modern research is supposed to, shall we say, declare one's personal perspective on a particular issue if it involves research. But also, I think there's something particularly valuable here in that as a 15-year-old schoolboy, some of the thoughts that I had at the time were borne out subsequently by the research. Some of the things that a 15-year-old schoolboy may have thought in 1982 are perhaps particularly telling as a sort of point of analysis. In other words, if I can think them as a schoolboy, then maybe there was some validity in terms of the obviousness of what we were dealing with. So, the commemoration of the Falklands War some 40 years ago is a particularly important moment, I think, in terms of our experiences and thinking about commemorating this particular war. Can everybody see the PowerPoint that I've just put up, hopefully in front of you?
Yes, though it's not on presentation view yet.
It's not on presentation view. Okay. Okay, let's try that. How does that look?
That's
Better?
not
Okay, so the commemoration of the Falklands War 40 years on from 1982 rightly seeks to place emphasis on remembering the human stories of those who served and in some cases lost their lives in a war which for the majority of the British public seemed to come out of nowhere in 1982. Wars do not, however, simply happen by themselves. They're the result of long planning and preparation, of calculation or willingness to take a risk. They can equally be the product of a lack of preparation or failure to detect a threat which might, in hindsight, seems to come from nowhere, but if one looks at it, you can see that it's actually developing. So wars can be perhaps seen as resulting from crimes of omission as well as commission. As we remember the events of 40 years ago, it's important to understand some of the political context of the war and how that came about, and how its origins were being interpreted as the task force sailed towards the South Atlantic. Those stories played a key role in how that war unfolded. The sense that Britain had done nothing wrong, that British territory had been seized by a brutal and failing dictatorship, and that vital interests of principle were at stake on which there could be no negotiation, helped to generate the sense of national unity that underpinned the military operations to retake the Falklands. In a democracy, that sense of unity is vital underpinning to military operations. The sense of unity was also necessary within a conservative government, which had been rocked by the Argentine invasion of the islands on 2nd of April. In the eyes of many backbenchers, someone had blundered, in the lines of Alfred Lord Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade poem. And while some were being sent south to do or die, British honour demanded that the wrongdoers must be punished. It was a very traditional British political response to perceived failure, and it was to cost Lord Peter Carrington, the Foreign Secretary, his job. Carrington, by 1982, had enjoyed a long and relatively distinguished parliamentary career. Born into an aristocratic family in 1919, he was educated at Eton before entering Sandhurst. You can see the photo on the right-hand side of the screen. He served with the Guards Armoured Division during the Second World War. He knew war's ugly face. And he inherited his father's title in 1938 at the relatively tender age of 19. After the war in 1946, he took his seat in the House of Lords on the Conservative benches, opposing the Attlee government. And with the return to power of the party in 1951 under Winston Churchill, he was appointed Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Agriculture. Carrington was a rising star of the Conservative Party. He was a rising star in the House of Lords. He was capable, a good administrator, an excellent speaker, in some ways rather academic in his mode of presentation. He was, in a sense, an old school conservative, well educated, thoughtful, and always gentlemanly in his responses. And that gentlemanly approach towards the issue of politics was further demonstrated when his department ran into trouble over the so-called Critchell Down affair, what today would be regarded as laughably small beer in terms of mistakes that politicians make. But Carrington's response was interesting. He offered to resign. He saw Churchill and he offered to resign. And Churchill said, "Do you really wish to resign? You've really done nothing wrong." And then Carrington said, "Well, no, but I rather think somebody ought to." Churchill persuaded him not to. In Carrington's eyes, resignation was the gentlemanly thing to do. It was the British thing to do. Churchill would simply have none of it. And indeed, so well did Carrington's career progress that Carrington immediately began to receive a move up the parliamentary ladder, becoming Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Defence. And at age 37, he became the British High Commissioner in Australia. In 1959, having enjoyed his time in Australia, he returned to England to be appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. He really is on the rise. But again, controversy followed Peter Carrington's career. And it followed largely as a result of the unmasking of a Soviet spy in his department. Now, the press carried out a witch hunt against those who they attacked for failing to identify the spy at a still earlier phase of the investigation. Conservative colleague Lord Hailsham remembered he was horribly maligned, along with a number of other conservative figures, before the press eventually realised it was actually very little to do with Carrington, and that essentially the spy had really been unmasked at the earliest available opportunity. The subsequent inquiry indeed found Carrington quite blameless. And indeed, 2 reporters were actually jailed during the process for failing to disclose the source of their information on the spy. In other words, an interesting switch of the tables. In 1970, Carrington became Secretary of State for Defence. And in 1972, he became chairman of the Conservative Party. Alongside this, in 1974, he served as Secretary of State for Energy, which, given the power issues in the 1970s, was particularly critical in terms of the infrastructure of the period. With the fall of Edward Heath, however, he relinquished his chairmanship of the party. He was considered a Heath man. And on his fall and the rise of Margaret Thatcher, his career seemed likely to enter the doldrums. But on the formation of the Thatcher government in 1979, Carrington returned to the cabinet, this time as Foreign Secretary, one of the top 3 posts in the government. Now, like any Shakespearean play, Carrington's distinguished career was to be the backdrop to the drama that would lead to his fall in 1982. He was the thoroughly English aristocrat, every inch the man of honour who believed passionately in the notion of responsibility for his actions and the responsibility for those taking action within the departments that he headed. For him, responsibility was utterly vital to British politics and good government. what today might be seen as the good chaps model of government. But in an increasingly cynical age, he was also, as for any former party chair will know, only too well aware of the needs and divisions within the party. He understood that the Conservative Party was a coalition. Indeed, in 1979, he may have returned to the cabinet, but he was only too well aware that with the shift to the right of the Conservative Party, he was still being identified as a Heath man. There were suspicions about him. He was a wet on in economic terms. He was not one of the Spartans leading the Thatcherite revolution. Indeed, to the Spartans of the Thatcherite revolution, he was an object of suspicion, a man who was a problem. Carrington was, however, a good minister, and his inclusion within the cabinet was also a political move on Margaret Thatcher's part to ensure that all factions of the Conservative Party felt included in the new administration. The fact that Carrington also sat in the unreformed, old-fashioned House of Lords rather than the House of Commons meant that he was somewhat of a disadvantage in terms of the inner workings of the Conservative Party. It was easier for the press to make him into a scapegoat, easier for him to become a target than a minister with a solid democratic mandate behind them. Now, as Foreign Secretary, Carrington had to deal with the foreign policy contexts around Britain in 1979. The Foreign Office has a very, very full agenda before it. Britain's relationship with the European Union was something that Margaret Thatcher very much wanted to change. The ongoing Cold War, difficulties with both the Soviet Union and China, and the need to work for peace in a world in which nuclear arsenals were fully stocked, while dealing with an unstable Middle East, in the middle of ongoing wars and the spread of Islamic radicalism as a result of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, offered a myriad of time-absorbing, potentially life or death challenges for the new Foreign Secretary. A close working relationship with the United States of America was seen as an absolute prerequisite for success on the broader issues of containing the Russian and Chinese threats. One consequence of this was that British defence policy was being reshaped with a force structure and capabilities designed almost exclusively to contain the Russian threat in Europe and the North Atlantic. This had, in the eyes of some of those around Margaret Thatcher, the added benefit of reducing the burden on the Exchequer to fund tax cuts and an economic transformation that they considered equally essential to arrest the decades of decline that they considered Britain had been locked into since 1945. Usefully on economic policy and indeed defence policy, there was a good deal of agreement between the Thatcher and Reagan government that would come into power in January 1981. This Anglo-American relationship was also expected to have some value in some of the more minor diplomatic issues facing Britain, many of which were related to the ongoing process of decolonisation and the withdrawal from empire seen to be in final throes in the late 1970s. This drawdown of empire would facilitate the reshaping of the force structure to contain the Soviets with east of Suez expeditionary capabilities consigned to the days of empire on which the sun was very firmly setting. Britain would have little need for the capabilities necessary for independent force projection, such as aircraft carriers carrying fixed-wings aircraft. Since any conflict, Britain and the United States would be side by side. The Americans, given the re-establishment of relations between Washington and Beijing, could help with issues such as negotiating on the issue of Hong Kong. Likewise, the Americans could play an important role over Gibraltar, given Spanish hopes to join NATO. They would join in May 1982. The nexus between the Cold War, Anglo-American relations, end of empire, and changes to force structure formed a powerful centre of gravity around which Britain defence and foreign policy was starting to revolve in the early 1980s. More of that shortly. Some areas, for example, such as the relationship with the European Union, largely stood beyond that nexus. So too the issue of Zimbabwe, the former colony with a breakaway regime since 1965 under Ian Smith, that continued to seek some kind of international respectability that would allow it to achieve formal independence. Although the white minority government of Ian Smith held an election in April 1979 to give an appearance of democracy, black leaders Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe were not able to take part in it, even though they had been released from prison. Smith wanted to maintain white settler power in a country in which the majority of the population were black, and British attempts to negotiate with the Smith government had repeatedly founded over this basic principle of power and democracy. This was a particularly thorny issue for Carrington, given the pro-white sympathies of the majority of the Conservative Party, especially the Parliamentary Conservative Party. To some extent, the emotional charged nature of the Zimbabwean issue overshadowed other issues where the rights of British subjects was equally at stake, perhaps without complicating factors. In his memoirs, Carrington affirms the distracting effect which Rhodesia, Zimbabwe had over British foreign policy, with potential foreign policy flashpoints being overlooked in consequence. In terms of British interests and global responsibilities, such flashpoints might come low down the list on the Foreign Office's list of priorities, but they might be rather higher on the list of priorities for the local regimes involved. The issue of Rhodesia, Zimbabwe absorbed much of the attention of the Foreign Office in 1979 and early 1980. That Carrington was able to move the parties towards an agreement under the Lancaster House talks accords at the end of 1979 was a considerable achievement that paved the way for Zimbabwean independence to be formally sanctioned on the 17th of April 1980, following fresh elections held from 27th to 29th February 1979. A thorny problem had been removed from the to-do list of the Foreign Office, and one more piece of empire was destined to be set free for the future. The repercussions of the Lancaster House agreement on the future of Zimbabwe, tragic though they are, have no place in this paper, but many within the Conservative Party were left in no doubt. Carrington was a trimmer, little better than an appeaser, conducting what amounted to a closing down sale of the British Empire and a going against the interests of its people. At the October 1979 Conservative Party conference, in the middle of the Lancaster House talks, Carrington was vilified by the Conservative right. During his speech from the podium, cries of "Carrington out" came from the floor. Anti-Carrington and pro-Rhodesia banners were on display. Anti-Carrington motions from the floor were suppressed, but three speakers nevertheless attacked Carrington from the podium in the speeches that they gave. Mrs. Thatcher had to step in to, shall we say, correct the views of the conference. At fringe meetings, Carrington's name was booed to the rafters, particularly by members of the Monday Club, with the New York Times reporting one unnamed backbencher, "It's a good thing he wasn't Foreign Secretary in 1939, or we would have sold out to Hitler." Within months of becoming Foreign Secretary, Carrington became a figure of hate for those on the right of the Conservative Party. Despite their differing outlooks, styles and backgrounds, and the occasional voluble row, Margaret Thatcher and Lord Carrington did make an effective team in foreign policy terms. Carrington would soothe, he would be gentle, making a handy foil to the occasionally brusque Margaret Thatcher's handbagging of foreign leaders. A gentleman with a tendency towards self-deprecation, an intellectual who did not appear to take things too personally, even from Margaret Thatcher. His capacity for hard work won him many admirers, and his principal pragmatism meant that he rarely backed himself into a corner over policy. But to members of a Conservative Party which were increasingly sort of ideological, this smacked of a lack of principle. Carrington the Trimmer was a reputation which haunted him following Zimbabwe. Carrington seemed to hark back to more patrician days and to an establishment that some regarded in 1979 as failing, an establishment that was being swept away by the Thatcher Revolution. While Carrington could usually be relied upon to win over Margaret Thatcher on matters foreign, it was on economic policy that Carrington and Thatcher really disagreed most profoundly. Such were their differences over the 1981 budget that Carrington was rumoured to have gone around uttering, "She'll be out by Christmas." This in turn led to a rumour of a potential plot within the Conservative Party to remove Thatcher, with Carrington replacing her as Prime Minister in a new wet look economic administration with Ted Heath somewhere in the background. This did nothing to ease the suspicions of the Thatcher loyalist about Carrington's ultimate loyalties. On a personal level, the rumours and antagonisms had a reasonably good working relationship. And indeed, on one overnight trip, Geoffrey Howe, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, quipped that the two of them reminded him of Dorothy Lamour and Bob Hope, which is rather an interesting comparison. 1982. By the start of 1982, Carrington had successfully managed the agenda of the Foreign Office to the point where some of the thorniest issues had gone. Zimbabwe had become independent. The relationship with the new Reagan administration was going from strength to strength. A rebate had been negotiated with the European Union. And yet, by 5th of April, Carrington had resigned as Foreign Secretary, as a military junta in Buenos Aires decided to use force to resolve what had been seen as one of those other hangovers of empire, a small matter, the status of the Falkland Islands, South Georgia, and the South Sandwich Islands, which had been claimed by Britain, Spain, France, and Argentina before the British established a viable settlement and de facto sovereignty in the 19th century. The Falkland Islanders were utterly firm in their desire to remain subjects of the Crown, rather than see some sort of control established by a military dictatorship in Buenos Aires that was busy waging a repressive and brutal crusade against its own people in the name of anti-communism. In the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from the UK, under the noses of an Argentine government that wished to press the case for the return of Las Malvinas, in part to distract the populace from the mismanagement of the economy and the political repression at home, the Falklands Islands had been seen as a potential flashpoint by the Foreign Office for several decades. Indeed, during the 1970s, the flash had almost come with a potential Argentine naval operation against the islands, which had been headed off by press reports, rumours of the presence of a British submarine in the waters of the South Atlantic. On coming into office in 1979, Carrington had been alive to the dangers potentially arising from a hostile regime in Buenos Aires and the perceived vulnerability of the Falklands. An attempt to negotiate a leaseback arrangement for the Falkland Islands, where Britain retained control of the islands, but some measure of Argentine sovereignty over the islands, was recognised, founded on the understandable suspicions of the islanders and their supporters in the Conservative Party. Given reactions over the settlement of the Zimbabwean issue, leaseback was regarded as more evidence of Carrington's inclinations as a trimmer and an appeaser. Carrington accepted that leaseback was dead in the water and that some new arrangement would have to be made. However, what really pulled the rug from under the feet of British diplomacy was the 1981 Defence Review by Secretary of State for Defence, Sir John Nott. As part of this process of forced restructuring and saving money, the Royal Navy was to be turned into little more than an anti-submarine force for the North Atlantic, with the Royal Marines and their assault ships being seen as effectively surplus to changing requirements. Once enacted, the Not Review meant that should some untoward event happen south of the equator, the British Armed Forces would struggle to manage anything other than a token conventional military response. Of particular significance was the decision to withdraw the ice patrol ship HMS Endurance from the South Atlantic. She was a symbol of Britain's commitment to the South Atlantic and the Falkland Islanders. The Argentine military junta read news of her withdrawal and the reshaping and downsizing of the British fleet exactly as might have anticipated. Indeed, to go back to my 15-year-old schoolboy self, it was perfectly obvious that you start downsizing the Royal Navy in the way that was being proposed, you could expect trouble at some point or other. And indeed, Conservative MP and Junior Defence Minister Keith Speed was sacked in 1981 over his refusal to swallow cuts, which he considered dangerous. For the Argentinians, British pride meant that they could not admit it openly, but Britain was no longer capable or interested in maintaining a commitment to the Falkland Islands or any of its possessions in the South Atlantic. The realization that the Foreign Office was simply running out of room to come to any kind of understanding with the junta, who then decided to retake the islands with force, which they did on the 2nd of April, prompting both an international as well as a domestic political crisis. The fall. The invasion of the Falkland Islands and the realization of just how weak a declining Britain was seen in some parts of the world came as a shock to the nation and the Conservative Party. On 3rd of April, a febrile Parliament held its first Saturday sitting since the Suez Crisis. The desire for answers led to open recriminations within the party, with Lord Carrington subject to open criticism. Patrick Cormack, the Conservative Minister for Staffordshire South West, expressed the temper of many on the backbenchers when he said, "Someone has blundered. I do not know who, and I do not know how." John Nott, in it, winding up his speech for the government, sounded both defensive, but also certain that they'd done everything possible. This was a sort of moment of sort of shock within the Conservative Party. What was Nott thinking? Because it was his defence review that was now considered key to the problem of what had happened. There were cries of resign. Now, Carrington in the Lords had a much more favourable ride, and he largely carried the House with him. The Conservative Parliamentary Party was, however, just getting into its stride, with Nott and Carrington summoning to a meeting that evening of the backbenchers. While most of the memoirs of the period draw a discreet veil over the meeting, it's clear that both Carrington and Nott were absolutely savaged for what was seen as a humiliation and a national disgrace. Carrington appears to have been somewhat surprised by the vehemence of what he encountered at that meeting. He wanted to resign. Deputy Prime Minister William Whitelaw persuaded him to stay his hand, at least for the moment, and allegedly to wait to see what the morning papers would offer. I don't necessarily buy that, because quite how the papers were going to interpret the volcanic nature of the Saturday sitting of the House of Commons left, I think, very little room for any imagination that it was going to turn out favourably in terms of press coverage for the government. Carrington appears to have been so surprised by things that the next morning when the press came out, Carrington was just, he'd made up his mind. He simply had to resign. He simply had to resign. He simply had to go, with the result that on the 5th of April, he took his seals of office to Windsor and formally resigned. Carrington's resignation bursts the inflating bubble of national indignation. The Times applauded his noble act. The search for other blunderers abated, even though a national opinion poll on 6th of April revealed that 60% of those polled thought that Margaret Thatcher should bear responsibility for the disaster that had taken place. In tones that became steadily more muted as elements of the task force began to move south, others continued to blame John Knott for the 1981 defence review. But the press began to come together as headlines of the invasion and Carrington's resignation became yesterday's news. The Committee of Inquiry into the invasion of the Falkland Islands, when it reported in 1981, found little fault in Carrington's handling of the Falkland Islands issue up to 1982, and noted that various factors meant that his political room for manoeuvre had been severely limited. This came as somewhat as a surprise to many people who assumed that he'd resigned. He must have been seriously at fault. And they then began to become realised that Carrington had performed in the same way that he had throughout his career. The public and party were ready to believe that someone had blundered, somebody needed to pay the price, and that Carrington was willing to offer himself up as a sacrifice. Without that sacrifice, the political divisions would have opened up. The government would have been paralysed, with the Prime Minister and Defence Secretary also under pressure to do the honourable thing. Carrington, as a former Defence Secretary, was also, I'm pretty sure, convinced that with Britain going to war, it could afford to lose a Foreign Secretary rather than a Defence Secretary, especially one who sat in the House of Lords. Better him than Thatcher and better him than not is Carrington's rationale in 1982. In resigning in 1982, Peter Carrington was doing the right thing by the party, and far more importantly, the country, as it faced a difficult military task so many miles from home. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. It's a funny position to not be able to hear any applause after such an interesting paper, but such are the travails of Zoom. As I say, if you've got any questions for Harry, put them in the chat. And I, for one, am interested in what elements of this have come from his correspondence and interview with Carrington himself. So you'll be hearing from me on that, if nothing else. And then before that, we're going to hear from, again, I'll introduce him, Dr. Louis Hillwood, who's our Philip Nicholas Trust Lecturer in Maritime History, who's talking on Britain, the United States, and the struggle for the Falkland Islands. Louis, take it away.
Hey, thank you, Jameson. Let me just get this slideshow going. Is that looking okay?
All good.
Splendid. Okay, thank you all for coming along this evening. I'm going to sort of almost pick up where Harry left off in a way, although there will be a little bit of backtracking, so apologies. I'll try not to make it too repetitive. So the Falklands War is often seen as a small, limited conflict, but the scope of it was really quite vast, certainly geographically. The British task force operating around 8,000 miles from its home ports. And the reverberations of the war were felt around the world too. So tonight I'm going to argue that the Falklands at large needs to be understood in global perspective, within the context of the Cold War, rather than a purely Anglo-Argentine dispute over islands in the South Atlantic. Indeed, for Britain and the United States, the conflict had implications for world order, the struggle over which underpinned the Cold War. British and American leaders consequently used the rhetoric of maintaining an international rules-based liberal order underpinned by the principles of democracy, freedom, and self-determination in order to justify their actions. The US response to the crisis was comparatively restrained, especially at first, but its wider Cold War considerations of Argentina's role in restraining communism in South America shaped this. But Britain's resolve to retake the Falklands forced the issue, with the US President Ronald Reagan ultimately opting to abandon neutrality and the search for a diplomatic solution to the crisis. The imperative of supporting British action within the wider context of preserving the liberal international order was also reflected in the unofficial support provided by the Pentagon, the US military and defense establishment. And this even started during the period of American official neutrality. Military, naval, and intelligence cooperation underpinned by the long-standing transatlantic strategic alignment, led to the American Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger choosing to circumvent the State Department, and perhaps even at times the White House, to ensure that Britain succeeded. Moreover, American aid may have been decisive in the eventual British victory, and at the very least made the campaign less costly for Britain. So to begin with, what was the relationship of the United States to the Falklands crisis and its opposing sides, Argentina and Britain? Both states were, of course, important allies to the US in the context of the Cold War. In the global struggle against communism and its major bulwark, the Soviet Union, the US had to manage a range of relationships with key partners around the globe. In Europe, perhaps its most important partner was Britain, a key member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and therefore a vital partner in defending Europe, as well as projecting sea power into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, of course, the US and Britain had been long-standing allies by the 1980s, with the so-called special relationship, especially in defense and intelligence matters, forged during the Second World War in particular. However, that was a conflict which also saw the United States displace Britain at the apex of the international order. And while Britain was one of America's most important allies, it was vastly less powerful, and the US was certainly not reliant on Britain in any meaningful way by the 1980s. And so the extent to which the US felt that it must support London in the pursuit of British interests did have its limits, revealed, of course, most starkly in the 1956 Suez Crisis, during which the American President Dwight D. Eisenhower forced the British government, led by Anthony Eden, to back down. And in that crisis, a major concern had been the risk of pushing Egypt towards the Soviet Union. And ultimately, it was these wider concerns over international order that would continue to shape Anglo-American relations during the Cold War. Meanwhile, British leaders, haunted by Suez, remained acutely aware that they would need, at the very least, implicit American backing in the pursuit of their own independent foreign policy objectives in the future. Now, Argentina, as a South American country, similarly had a long-standing relationship with Washington, underpinned by the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. And this, of course, saw the US assert its special interests in South America and exclude other powers from interfering. During the Cold War, the spread of communism in Latin America was a major concern, especially for the Reagan administration from 1980 onwards. In their view, Argentina and its right-wing junta under President Leopoldo Galtieri, they were critical allies to halting the spread of communism. And this was particularly the case in this period with regard to the situation in Nicaragua. Argentina supported the Contras, who were fighting the Marxist Sandinista junta there. Now, the Argentinian leadership were well aware of this perceived importance in Washington, and they attempted to leverage this role with regard to the Falkland Islands in particular in late 1981. Supposedly at that point, discussions took place over the creation of a South Atlantic Treaty Organization, which might potentially use the Falkland Islands as a base, possibly with Washington looking to overrule British views on that. But more broadly, the junta anticipated that any movement made on the Falklands would be supported by Washington under the guise of decolonization and even the Monroe Doctrine itself. So, Galtieri then, in 1982, felt emboldened to invade the Falkland Islands, expecting not only that the British government, which was led by Margaret Thatcher, would accept this as a fait accompli, but also that President Reagan would permit this move and prevent any risk of escalation. Now, while the former calculation famously proved to be catastrophic in terms of the judgment of British resolve, the latter expectation in regards to Reagan was not necessarily that sort of far wide of a mark at first. Washington immediately involved itself in the crisis following the invasion on the 2nd of April 1982, but it adopted an official stance of neutrality. In Buenos Aires, this was welcomed, perhaps even viewed as a form of implicit American support for their actions. Within parts of the American government, most notably the State Department, the view was taken that Britain should not respond to the invasion militarily, and a diplomatic solution should be found instead. Now, the State Department during this period was headed by Alexander Haig, a former US Army general, and he was assisted as Assistant Secretary of State by a man called Thomas Enders, a career diplomat. Now, Haig and Enders both feared that weighing into this dispute against Argentina would damage American anti-communist policy in South America, believing that the junta's failure to hold on to the Falklands would see it collapse and be replaced by a left-wing government, leading to the further spread of communism in South America. Indeed, such were their efforts to foster good ties with Buenos Aires that by chance Haig and Enders were actually attending a dinner at the Argentinian embassy in Washington on the night of the invasion. And they were joined there by Jeane Kirkpatrick, another ardent anti-communist who was serving as the American ambassador to the United Nations at the time. Now, Kirkpatrick was perhaps the most outspoken American official about the importance of good relations with Argentina. And she'd even published an essay titled Dictatorships and Double Standards in 1979, in which she argued that supporting the likes of Galtieri and others was necessary as part of the effort to defeat communism globally. Now, Kirkpatrick ultimately saw the Falklands crisis really as a small colonial issue. She saw this as minor compared to the global struggle against communism, which dominated the Cold War. And she emphasized the importance of prioritizing Argentina over Britain in this regard, even telling the CBS program Face the Nation, and I quote here, "If the Argentines own the islands, then moving troops into them is not armed aggression," unquote. Okay, the American official, of course, who mattered most was the man on the left here, President Ronald Reagan. But Reagan proved incapable of managing his team coherently during the crisis and struggled to formulate a robust policy response. Indeed, his first public statement on the crisis summarized this confusion perhaps best when he said, quote again, "It's a very difficult situation for the United States because we're friends with both of the countries engaged in this dispute, and we stand ready to do anything we can to help them. And what we hope for and would like to help in doing is have a peaceful resolution of this," unquote. And there is Alexander Haig there with Margaret Thatcher. So the Americans opted for neutrality, but the Thatcher government opted decisively to retake the Falkland Islands, and they did so without really consulting the Americans. Of course, the memory of Suez lingered, but Thatcher and her cabinet were clear that they were in the right here. However, Thatcher recognized that she would need to engage carefully with the Reagan administration and try to bring the Americans around, later stating, I quote again, "We could not afford to alienate the United States," unquote. So at this point in time, Thatcher is trying to pull off a balancing act, trying to show resolve on the one hand that Britain would retake the Falklands, but also reasonableness. So what Britain was doing was not unreasonable in international affairs. And Britain, to do this, skillfully used the United Nations as a forum to try to build support for its position. The British ambassador, Sir Anthony Parsons, passed a resolution that Argentina must withdraw its forces, and the US voted along with Britain to pass this resolution. Thatcher, meanwhile, went to Reagan and asked him to impose economic sanctions on Argentina. The White House responded with some action, an arms embargo, which was a subtle but not insignificant move towards Britain's position, but this wasn't what Thatcher wanted. So the US at this stage, very early in the crisis, appears to be moving very slowly towards a British position, but there's plenty of space here still, it seems, to Alexander Haig in particular, that there's room here for a diplomatic solution. And it's important to really note the character of the conflict in early April. It would be weeks before the task force reached the Falklands, and there were widespread doubts at this point internationally as to whether this would really escalate into a genuine armed conflict. There's a number of historians that have argued it was really the sinking of General Belgrano which changed this. And the reason it was so shocking is because it became very clear at that point that this was going to become a real war, essentially. It wasn't necessarily these controversies about the direction of travel of the General Belgrano. It's because it was a major loss of life, proving that Britain was prepared to use force to retake the Falklands, and it was going to do so in a devastating fashion. But that wasn't until the 2nd of May, 1982. So throughout April, the Secretary of State Haig undertook so-called shuttle diplomacy between Buenos Aires, London, and Washington, trying to find a way to end the crisis without bloodshed. His aim was also really to find a way out of the crisis with Galtieri saving face. When he told the British ambassador to the US, Nicholas Henderson, this, he was utterly aghast. He called Haig, I quote here, a consistent own goal scorer, unquote. Haig met with Thatcher during the shuttle diplomacy on the 8th of April 1982. Thatcher expressed her bemusement at American neutrality, and Haig responded that the US was not impartial, but wanted to avoid bloodshed. And he put forward at this point a proposal that Argentina should withdraw its forces, and then there should be the creation of an interim administration composed of Canada, the United States, and 2 other Latin American countries to oversee the islands. And then a solution would be worked out with London and Buenos Aires entering into negotiations. Thatcher, perhaps unsurprisingly, flatly refused the suggestion, declaring once again that Britain must recover the Falkland Islands. And this was really a crucial meeting. It started to now close off American diplomatic avenues. For room to negotiate was quickly diminishing. Thatcher was convinced that Britain must retake the Falklands, and Reagan began to realize then that the US will probably have to make a decision sooner rather than later. And indeed, a week later, Reagan told Galtieri that the US was going to be put into a difficult position if fighting did break out. Reagan tried to press Thatcher again around the same time, wanting to find a way to avoid bloodshed, but Thatcher at this point replied, and I quote from her, "Any suggestion that conflict can be avoided by a device that leaves the aggressor in occupation is surely gravely misplaced. The implications for other potential areas of tension and for small countries everywhere would be of extreme seriousness. The fundamental principles for which the free world stands would be shattered," unquote. And she ended her letter, I quote again, "It is essential that America, our closest friend and ally, should share with us a common perception of the fundamental issues of democracy and freedom which are at stake, as I am sure you do," unquote. So here, Thatcher was skillfully explaining the logic of British actions in the context of preserving world order, which was, of course, a primary American interest. She used the rhetoric of the liberal international order to justify the British mission and try to win Reagan's support. Now, in late April, the Foreign Secretary replaced Lord Carrington, of course, Sir Francis Pym, visited Washington and negotiated with Haig for a diplomatic solution, which centered on giving the Falkland Islanders the option to choose between Argentina and Britain. Now, while Pym advised the cabinet to accept this, Thatcher was dismayed. But John Knott, the Defence Secretary, suggested putting these terms to Galtieri regardless in order to put pressure on Argentina, because if they refused, then it might become easier for Reagan to declare his support for Britain. This effort also averted attention while British forces retook South Georgia on the 25th of April. Haig obliged, and he put this plan to the junta on the 27th of April, and they rejected it the following day, as predicted. They stated that they would settle for nothing less than recognition of Argentinian sovereignty over the Falkland Islands. Now, Thatcher seized on this, writing to Reagan that Britain would be disappointed if the US did not now support Britain. Reagan replied that the US still desired a peaceful solution, but more importantly, told Thatcher, quote again, "There can be no doubt about our full support for you and the principles of international law and order you are defending. You can count on that support in whatever form this issue is debated. You can also count on our sympathetic consideration of requests for assistance," unquote. So Reagan was also embracing the rhetoric of preserving world order as the fundamental purpose of Britain's effort to retake the Falklands. And it now seemed only a matter of time before the US would publicly side with Britain. On the 30th of April, President Reagan announced that the US neutrality policy had come to an end, and he formally supported Britain. The US would now take economic measures against Argentina, as Thatcher had asked for at the start of the month, and it would also start officially providing military aid to Britain. Haig, meanwhile, declared that his diplomatic mission had resulted in failure on the 2nd of May 1982, the day the Belgrano was sunk. Haig claimed, actually, that this action would reduce international support for Britain, but Nicholas Henderson told him that they both knew from Signal's intelligence reports that the Argentine cruiser was in fact readying to launch an assault on the Royal Navy task force. And indeed, intelligence provided by GCHQ throughout the crisis was particularly useful, as it headed off Haig's efforts to try to convince the British government that the Soviet Union was involved in some way, or that a moderate centre was emerging in Buenos Aires that could help to resolve the crisis. More broadly, it was clear that public support in the US was firmly behind Britain. An opinion poll conducted during the conflict revealed that 83% of Americans supported the British government's response. The US Senate also made its views known in late April, passing a resolution stating that the US could not remain neutral and must help Britain. The reasons for the US support for Britain were ultimately myriad. One of these was a fear in the White House that failure would bring down Thatcher's government. This might lead to a Labour government, which would not necessarily share the same political and economic philosophies as the Conservatives and Republicans seemed to at this time. And indeed, Michael Foot as Prime Minister might even seek to disarm Britain with regard to nuclear weapons and leave it with a diminished role in NATO. So the Cold War context mattered not just in Latin America. Britain was needed as a strong military ally in Europe. Consequently, the defeat of a NATO ally in a military expedition to the South Atlantic could undermine the credibility of the alliance more broadly, even if the Falklands did fall out of the scope, outside the scope of NATO. And so, of course, the purpose of NATO was essentially to deter the Soviet Union and maintain the American-led liberal international order. So I contend then that really American support was underpinned by the wider importance of preserving international law and world order. This, I think, was the critical issue that explains the United States' ultimate support for Britain when it came to the choice between these two strategic partners. Now, in some ways, the most significant impact of the American declaration of support for Britain on the subsequent course of the conflict was that Thatcher could now continue without needing to worry as much about placating Washington. The task force could now proceed unhindered, and indeed it landed at San Carlos Bay between the 21st and 25th of May. But the US did provide direct material support that proved incredibly useful to the British Armed Forces. This had begun long before the American public declaration of support. Although the State Department emphasized the importance of Argentina in the Cold War, the Pentagon and the American military establishment believed that support for Britain was much more significant, and they moved swiftly, without the knowledge necessarily of the State Department, to deliver aid to the British task force. As the US Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, later put it, quote, from the Pentagon's perspective, support for Britain was immediate, thorough, and decisive. We met British requests from day one in a manner that would have been impossible with any other ally. What observers often miss is that our support was built from the bottom up rather than a top down. There was no need for a political decision to be taken from on high. Unquote. And of course, secrecy was therefore required, and Lehman explained that, quote, many cabinet level officials, including Jeane Kirkpatrick, were unaware of the scale of the effort underway. Unquote. Now, the man on the right here, the Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, was crucial to this endeavor, so much so that in 1988 he received an honorary knighthood from Britain. From the start, he took the view that assisting Britain would not impact relations in Latin America, and moved swiftly to provide military material, telling Lehman, quote, give Maggie everything she needs to get on with it, unquote. The Pentagon handled this by transferring material to American depots on Ascension Island. Ascension, which was leased by Britain to the US as a military base known as Wide Awake, was the key staging post for the task force, where it would resupply and prepare for the assault into the South Atlantic. The US sent material there, and Britain simply paid for whatever it chose to take. This included aviation fuel. 12.5 million tons of AVCAT was ultimately provided by the Americans to Britain, and this ensured there were no fuel shortages during Operation Corporate. Again, secrecy was needed in all of this. Lieutenant Colonel William Bryden, who was in charge of Wide Awake, was told by Weinberger, quote, give the Brits every possible assistance. but not under any circumstances to get caught doing so. And indeed, as part of this, journalists were prevented from going on to Ascension. Other aid provided by the US included 150,000 square yards of matting, so a temporary airstrip could be created. This enabled the Royal Air Force to fly over 600 sorties from Ascension using BC-10s and Hercules aircraft. And the US also gave the British task force 200 of the latest generation of Sidewinder missiles, which you can see in the middle of the screen here. These were particularly useful given the limitations of the British Harrier jump jet, especially in terms of range. These new Sidewinder missiles enabled British pilots to fire at Argentinian aircraft from the side or head-on, greatly assisting with the eventual shooting down of 19 Argentinian aircraft during the subsequent fighting. Thatcher herself later wrote that without the skilled British pilots, I quote her, using the latest version of the Sidewinder air-to-air missile supplied by Caspar Weinberger, we could not have retaken the Falklands, unquote. So Thatcher clearly thinking that these were crucial. But they weren't the only munitions provided. Other provisions included Stinger missiles, Shrikes, as well as 200 Mark 46 torpedoes. The US also delivered the Vulcan Phalanx anti-missile gun system to HMS Illustrious, and it was even suggested that the US Navy might lend the British an aircraft carrier should something go wrong. Lehman himself later claimed that this was supposed to be the USS Iwo Jima. Others suggested that it might have included the USS Eisenhower going down to the South Atlantic. And as mentioned earlier, intelligence was another area in which there was plenty of Anglo-American cooperation. American satellites provided IMINT, while according to Michael Parsons, Eland and SIGINT were supposedly passed to Britain, even during the period of American neutrality. Now, despite public support for Britain, parts of the US government still hoped that a face-saving solution could be found well into late May. Jeane Kirkpatrick continued to work on a deal at the UN through to the day that HMS Fearless entered the exclusion zone. But Argentina, once again, rejected these proposals. Once the landings began, the war continued to escalate, especially once HMS Coventry and the Atlantic Conveyor were hit by Exocet missiles on the 25th of May. Alexander Haig realized that the escalation of the conflict made a negotiated settlement very unlikely. But after Britain had successfully landed and defeated Argentinian forces at Goose Green on the 29th of May, the US began to pressure London once more into agreeing this time a ceasefire agreement. 2 days later, Reagan, supposedly under pressure from Kirkpatrick herself, phoned Thatcher and requested that Britain end the campaign short of total victory because the US were concerned about Galtieri's downfall. Thatcher was annoyed. Henderson described her reply to Reagan as withering. Now, at the end of the week on the 4th of June, a ceasefire motion was tabled at the United Nations by Panama and Spain. Britain opted to veto this, and Haig initially told Kirkpatrick the US should do the same. But he then changed his mind and told her to abstain. However, the vote had already taken place. So this led to the very unusual step of Kirkpatrick announcing after the vote that she wanted it recorded, but she would change her vote if it was possible. Of course, it wasn't, but this was very awkward. And the confusion in American diplomacy was compounded when Reagan was then asked for his view the following day. He was now in Versailles in France at this point, and he didn't appear to know what had happened either. Nevertheless, this event did start to signal an important shift in the American tone after a month of solid backing for Britain. With victory on the Falkland Islands now looking increasingly certain, the US shifted towards finding a moderate resolution to the fighting rather than a complete defeat for Argentina. Rather than let this drive a wedge between them, however, Thatcher and Reagan worked to show a united front during his visit to London on the 8th of June. You can see a picture of him there in London next to a portrait of Sir Winston Churchill, trying to allude to that transatlantic special relationship. And on the 8th of June, Reagan gave a speech in the Houses of Parliament in which he once again highlighted the importance of ideas of world order and the Cold War context of this conflict. He started the speech by talking about democracy, including the struggle in Poland, and even reflected on historic struggles for freedom, listing Thermopylae, Spartacus, the storming of the Bastille and the Warsaw Uprising, as well as more recent events in El Salvador. And he then turned to the Falklands War, saying, I quote again, "On distant islands in the South Atlantic, young men are fighting for Britain. And yes, voices have been raised protesting their sacrifice for lumps of rock and earth so far away. But those young men aren't fighting for mere real estate. They are fighting for a cause, for the belief that armed aggression must not be allowed to succeed, and that the people must participate in the decisions of government under the rule of law. If there had been firmer support for that principle some 45 years ago, perhaps our generation wouldn't have suffered the bloodletting of World War II. Quote. This mention of the ongoing conflict was brief but significant, and after a further discussion of some issues, the president concluded, I quote again, "No, democracy is not a fragile flower. Still, it needs cultivating. If the rest of the century is to witness the gradual growth of freedom and democratic ideals, we must take actions to assist the campaign for democracy." Unquote. And 10 days later, Reagan would congratulate Britain on its victory in the war, and he offered American support in its aftermath. Pressure remained for London to enter into negotiations with Buenos Aires over the future of the islands in the long term, but Thatcher was unmoved, focusing instead on thanking Reagan, I quote her, "for all the support and help which we have received from the United States." Unquote. Now, on reflection, there had certainly been moments of Anglo-American tension during the war. John Knott later claimed that, I quote him, "the Americans were very, very far from being on our side." Unquote. But even the efforts of Haig to find a negotiated settlement, which irked the British cabinet at times, did serve a purpose, even if inadvertently, because it bought Britain time as the task force readied for the assault into the South Atlantic. At the very least, it can be said that it was a vastly different American response to the Suez Crisis, although, of course, the situation itself was vastly different too. Nevertheless, it should be reflected on that the US incurred costs to its own interests by remaining neutral and then backing Britain. As Washington and the State Department in particular feared, Galtieri was removed from power, and this led to the restoration of democracy in Argentina, and Raúl Alfonsín became president in 1983. And he would go on to disagree with President Reagan over the situation in Nicaragua, although Galtieri himself had decided to stop supporting the Contras as soon as the US announced its support for Britain in the spring of 1982. Nevertheless, this did lead, albeit somewhat indirectly, to the infamous Iran-Contra scandal, which mired Reagan in controversy, to put it mildly. Nevertheless, this was less significant to the US than supporting Britain, because as a NATO ally, Britain would be a critical partner in the final decade of the Cold War. And more broadly, the effort to preserve, and in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, to extend the American-led liberal international order took priority. The idea of the defense of democracy and freedom underpinned Britain's response to the invasion of the Falkland Islands. And in the end, Reagan chose to overrule the State Department and side with those in the defense establishment who were already aiding Britain. This aid may not have necessarily decided the outcome of the war, but it certainly made victory much more attainable. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Louis. So now we're going to move towards the questions. Some of us will be aware that there's quite a lot going on in the chat area, although I would say that the main outcome of that is largely that Michael Warenga has asked a question about the sailors and what they knew about the conflict and what they expected, and has received quite a few reminiscences from people with first and second-hand knowledge of same. So there's actually quite a lot of very interesting stuff happening there, which I think is probably well, I think I'll let that go for the second, because I think some of those are direct answers to my question in a lot of ways. And while that carries on, I'm actually going to put Elliot's earlier question to Harry here, which is effectively, how did Thatcher react to Carrington's resignations and the calls for her to take responsibility rather than Carrington?
I think in a way she was, on the one hand, sad to see him go, but on the other hand, deeply relieved. I think she thought that maybe it wouldn't be enough. And I think she was sort of pleasantly relieved that in fact it was enough, that the public got behind the task force, the media began to get off her back in a sense, and that they could begin to make some sort of progress. And it was the idea that that somebody who had blundered potentially had become the scapegoat, had become the fall guy, had taken responsibility, and the action was being taken. That the task force was proceeding, the task force was leaving port, and that something concrete was being done. And it's those two things: the sense that honour had been satisfied in that one of the politicians had fallen upon their sword, and the sense that actually Britain is now going to do the right thing and is going to try and retake the Falklands if the diplomacy doesn't work, that I think began to get the press off the public's back. But it's the images of the elements of the task force beginning to depart that I think really began to mean that the public began to think, well, whatever the politics of this are, we've got to get behind those who are going south. That, as it were, there's so much at stake now. There are so many loved ones who are departing, and we desperately want them to come home, that we can't have the politics of this just rumbling on, that we have to bury those political considerations for the moment, and we've got to get behind our soldiers, our sailors, of all varieties as this conflict begins to unfold.
Thank you, Harry. Now we've got two pretty detailed questions from James Smith in the questions in the chat here. I'm going to go in reverse order just so we can alternate speakers here. Louis, I don't know if you can see this yourself. I'm going to try and summarize, but because it is quite technical, I may mangle it. Verbatim, do you think that John Layman, as Secretary of the Navy, threw support behind helping Britain because of the success of the Royal Navy would support his case for massive investment in the US Navy? And subsequently, the loss of British warships could also have created issues for the US Navy, which could have handed, the danger of sea control to the Soviets. So sort of the US political and cabinet struggles around some of this.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. Thank you, James. And I think you're correct in both points. In terms of sort of kind of selling sea power, as it were, this is the first major naval conflict since the Second World War. And if it had gone badly wrong and a task force had been destroyed, then it would probably raise serious doubts about the utility of sea power in modern warfare, essentially, where aircraft carriers, for instance, still viable platforms, or had they gone the way of a battleship? I wonder if both British carriers have been lost, for example. Might that have been a debate that was had? Also, just in terms of proving that, conducting combined operations, or amphibious operations, the Americans like to call them, showing that this sort of power projection is still feasible. I think the Falklands did serve as an important case study for NATO at large, and that certainly did come into American calculations, the idea that a NATO partner needed to be seen to have succeeded here. And then in terms of that interreliance dynamic, you mentioned, I'm just going to have a quick read about again, the issues for the US needing to cut to American sea power and handing control to the Soviet Navy. Yeah, I think absolutely the Royal Navy, which was already, not in a great way, as Harry has alluded to before, and further cuts looming. I think if more British warships have been lost, yes, it absolutely makes it more imperative for the US to carry the burden, and US, as we know today, likes to have allies who shoulder their fair share as well. If we look at the 2% NATO target, for instance, and I did find it quite interesting, just how flexible the Americans were. This idea that the Iwo Jima, for instance, would be sent to replace one of the British carriers if one was lost, is very curious indeed, but also not a new idea. This is exactly the proposition that Sir Arthur Balfour puts to Colonel House when he goes to Washington in 1917 during the First World War. And there's lots of talk about essentially the way that the Royal Navy and US Navy can help each other out by loaning each other battleships at that point in time. But you see a very similar dynamic here. So it does speak to, I think, in the American Navy in particular, a wider appreciation of the importance of alliances in maintaining, well, for lack of a better word, I suppose you might say command of the sea, but really maintaining freedom of navigation. I hope that goes some way to answering the question. I think it was a very good one. So good 2 questions. So thank you, James.
And as for James's question to Harry, I'm actually going to append my own previously stated query to it as well, which is, James has specified, did Lord Carrington ever on public record state that he wished he had not resigned? Was he ever publicly critical of the proposed cuts in 1981, especially given his previous background as First Lord of the Admiralty? But of course, I'm interested in your sources here, Harry, as to whether he also did any of this privately.
If he did things privately, he didn't say, he didn't tell the world about it. He was interviewed sort of later on. He was certainly interviewed at one point, and one interviewer asked him in some detail about his reasons for resignation. And he made it very clear that he wasn't doing it to save Margaret Thatcher. He didn't regret what he did, but effectively said, well, somebody needed to take responsibility. That's really the way he put it. It's almost a kind of an aristocratic reflex in terms of there had been a problem and somebody needed to take responsibility for it, and I thought it should be me. Now, to go on to James's question, in a sense, if this was not somebody who would have raised in public issues about, I'm not really happy with the defence cuts. It's the kind of thing that he would have probably, if he was going to say it, he would have said it in private. However, what we might say, though, is that Carrington came from a generation of politicians that really regarded Britain's best days as lying behind it. The idea of a kind of slow decline, the state of the economy, we have to downsize, we work in partnership with the Americans. I think Carrington was signed up to that agenda effectively, increasing Anglo-American partnership and relationship. Now, I don't think he would have gone down the full John Knott line in 1981 by any means, but I think he's basically committed to the idea of a Royal Navy which is withering on the vine as Britain seeks to, and this is their mindset rather than the way I think of it, withering on the vine, and we're getting rid of these last little bits of empire that are sort of in the late 20th century. These are unfortunate hangovers from the days of empire. So he would have been happy to accept that notion of decline, I think, whether or not he said so in public or whether he said so in private.
Thank you, Harry. And that's a question I'm not sure who which one of you two is going to answer it. But Dan Hogan has asked whether Argentina was still receiving material support from elsewhere, specifically South American nations.
Well, I will have a go, although I'm afraid I can't actually answer that question because I'm not sure. Maybe Harry will know that particular one, but I will offer instead, for what it's worth, one thing that I did find interesting researching this is role for French and differing views on whether the French were sort of helpful or not. I think if I've just pulled up my notes, I didn't include it in the talk because I would have gone well over time and I was long enough as it was. But John Knott, as I said the Americans he didn't think were on Britain's side, but he said only Mitterrand and the French remained staunch allies to the end. In so many ways, Mitterrand and the French were our greatest allies, unquote. It's interesting because he's alluding really here to the fact that the French did offer Britain some military support. They gave Britain fighter jets of the same type that the Argentinians used, so that Britain could train in sort of fighting these. And Thatcher also acknowledged a debt of gratitude to the French, as Parsons puts it. But Lehman, the American Secretary of the Navy, was highly critical of the French. And he notes that the French actually did nothing to remove a team of technicians who were with the Argentine forces, who'd been training them how to use these French jets like the Superintendent. And these technicians, he claims, enabled Argentina to adapt its Exocet missiles, which he thinks otherwise wouldn't have worked at all. They would have been inoperable. So the numerous British losses to the Exocet missiles were a result of French assistance itself. So yeah, a real contested sort of debate about the role of French in terms of assisting both sides there. In terms of South America, I'm afraid I'm not sure, so I'll ask Harry in case you know anything about this one.
I don't know. I don't know about South America, but I'd be pretty sure that there was some support. In other words, there were things going down on the South American mainland which we've still not got to the bottom of, either in terms of, shall we say, British operations or indeed support for the Argentinians. But I think the issue, for at least the British press, the issue of the Exocet missile, as supplied by the French, became the key thing in terms of support for the Argentinian armed forces. And there was a great deal of concern, both in terms of the levels of technical assistance which the French company was delivering to the Argentine armed forces, and also whether or not the French were, by one means or another, supplying the Argentine armed forces with additional exocets after they'd been used to sort of, attack, for example, HMS Sheffield, when they realized just how effective these things were in terms of use against the task force. This is something that the press really latched onto. So there was this kind of Anglo-French tension during the operations to retake the Falklands over just what are the French up to, in private as well as public.
Thank you. Okay, so as we go through, we've got a question from Louise Claire asking, well, I'll ask it verbatim. Harry, you mentioned the diversionary ploy thesis as reasoning behind Argentina's actions on the 2nd of April. This view at the time until this day remains pretty prevalent in British and US literature on the topic. And her question isn't really about the ploy itself, but about the role of the press in creating and sustaining it.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, and if you think about it from the point of view of the British, actually getting to grips with the fine print of the sovereignty issue over the Falkland Islands was somewhat problematic. In other words, this wasn't the kind of thing that was going to sell newspapers. Finding means to attack the junta in public, to find fault with it, that was fairly common. So the idea that you downplay their potential sovereignty claims by saying they don't really have those claims and they're only doing this because they're a vile military dictatorship, they're killing their own people, and their economy's gone to pot. This was actually, I would say, part of a process of othering the Argentinians, because actually most British people had never met anybody from Argentina. The world was a different place in the 1980s. I remember the first Argentinian I actually met was 1983. I remember it very, very fondly. In terms of, the surprise of meeting somebody from Argentina. So this was a process, I think, of othering, which the British press was engaged in. I mean, certainly, most South American governments have had massive issues with things like inflation and the running of the economy. So this was a fairly easy one to actually sell to the British public. And of course, what it's also doing is shall we say, it's encouraging the British to think, we can win. We can beat these people. Their economy's gone to pot. They can't stand a long war, even if they've got sort of support from other South American governments, at least at the rhetorical level, behind them. So that's the kind of way I would view it.
Thank you, Harry. We've got a few more minutes for questions, so if anyone does have ones, do let me know. And I'm fascinated by the fact that our chat here has generated, frankly, as much information as it has questions, which is very nice to see. Elliot, if you can find a way to capture that would be terrific. I've one for Louis about, and this is of course the question of backfilling and semi-covertly supplying supplies to allies is very relevant today. These sidewinders, how, given the secrecy around Ascension Island, how long or were they able to use these things without it becoming really apparent that they were using these things? For example, if they're much more effective and in different ways than kit the British had, is the American supply there very apparent, at least to the Argentinians early on? Is an issue made of this? And if so, is the whole secrecy thing really only a short-term manner?
I'm not sure when the Argentinians worked out just how much support the Americans were giving. Of course, really, but the whole secrecy thing is only taking place over a period of around sort of 4 weeks or so anyway. And yeah, by the time they're being used in action, of course, America has said it's going to provide you with the UK military assistance. So yeah, I suppose in that sense, there's a reason why I can't think of any point at which it becomes controversial, because America's saying it's going to provide support. So yeah, but certainly in terms of Caspar Weinberger's view, I would say, I think in his own mind is convinced that Reagan is going to come around supporting the British, but this neutrality thing is really just, again, unintentionally, but what it's doing is buying Britain time to get the task force ready and down to South Atlantic without, say, maybe someone else stepping in, basically, and another less helpful negotiator trying to put pressure on Britain to come to terms at the UN or something. So I think he's pretty happy to maybe circumvent aspects of a chain of command, I think might be a polite way to put it, to provide support, because he's pretty sure that this is the direction the wind is blowing regardless. So yeah, it's really just about keeping it away from the State Department as much as possible. In places, he doesn't mind Hague being let in on some of his stuff, but otherwise it's sort of, it's done in such a way that it's a fait accompli. Well, Ascension and Wide Awake is American base, so of course we're going to have missiles there, and of course we're going to have munitions and torpedoes and fuel, aviation fuels, and of course we're going to have that there. And if the British want to pick up some of that as they come along, they're going to give us money for it. Well, that's all well and good. But yeah, it's very much a short-term thing, because once US comes out publicly, then yeah, the cat's out of the bag for sure.
Thank you. And we're seeing in the chat here comments from John Hinchcliffe, amongst others, with more details of how all that works. It sounds like we sort of take for granted the US has immense capacity to just materialize supplies when and as needed, and obviously it sounds like it was a great deal more complicated than that, which is usually the case. So there's a lot in the chat. I may well have missed any, but if there are any last questions, please fire them in now. Otherwise, I will get going in a second.
Well, actually, one thing I just want to pick up on is Dennis Hogan's question about whether the Belgrano was Argentina's only capital ship. Often overlooked, and Harry, I'm sure, is going to know much more about this, so hopefully you can put him on the spot to tell us, to enlighten us all, really. But of course, there is an Argentinian aircraft carrier, the 25 de Mayo, which is trying to mount a strike on the task force, proves to be unsuccessful. I'm going to hand over to Harry, because I think he will have something much more enlightening to say here.
Dropped the said ship into the chat himself.
Yes, I'm glad you did the Spanish on that. 25th of May.
Yeah, 25th of May. 25 de Mayo. Yeah.
Yeah, equipped with Skyhawks, because I think if I remember rightly, the Super 8 Andors were mostly sort of flying off fixed bases, places like Ushuaia, with their Exocets, but certainly the Skyhawk were very capable aircraft, as the Americans had discovered in Vietnam. So the idea of, certainly with the sinking of the Belgrano, that her and the Belgrano were moving in a pincer formation north and south to the east of the Falklands to try and catch the task force between themselves and the land. Yeah, that was a real issue, without a doubt.
That's great. Thank you, Harry. And I am seeing some thanks from people in the chat as well. So I think you can take it that this has indeed been interesting. And again, I'd like to thank everyone who's contributed in the chat, because one of the things I'm really keen on capturing this year is a lot of that memory. I know that there's an oral history project of sorts going on at the box, and in a second I'll ask Harry to tell us what he knows about that very briefly. But getting these memories and this knowledge is one of the really big opportunities we have this year. And so I'd like to thank people for contributing that. And so thank you, Louis, and thank you, Harry. And Harry, if you would like to play us out by telling us something about this oral history project.
Yeah, the box has been capturing memories, and I also think artifacts in terms of documents and things like that that have been discovered as part of an oral history program. So the box in Plymouth are very interested in trying to capture some of the memories of this, because I do think it's important. I mean, a recent statistic suggested that half of those people who are now alive in the United Kingdom were not alive in 1982 and have absolutely no memory whatsoever of the Falklands. And it really is a privilege to be on a Zoom call, not just with so many veterans, but indeed in some cases the families of those who went south in 1982. You know, what was achieved by our armed forces and the Merchant Navy and the Royal Fleet Auxiliary in 1982 was nothing less than astounding. And I was one of those individuals as a kid who was holding his breath, who was there every night watching every news broadcast, who would stay up every night watching Newsnight for the latest news about what was taking place in the South Atlantic. And it's always a pleasure many years later to meet those people who went south in 1982 and achieved so much in a corner of the world that, you know, most people had never really heard of prior to April 1982. So it's been an absolute privilege to have you here tonight.
That's great. Thank you both for coming, for putting this together. I encourage people, I guess, who aren't from Plymouth to look up the box, which is our museum and archive combined with, and that includes the local dockyard museum as well. And so the stories not only of the servicemen, but the dockyard workers and the suppliers of the region are involved there as well. Take a look at that. There are more events coming up across the city and, of course, the country. We will be emailing out any further things that we are involved in ourselves. So thanks everyone for coming. It's, as Harry says, a useful date to get started on commemorating and thinking about the Falklands. And we'll be in touch with more events as and when they develop. So thank you everyone. Have a good night, and we'll talk to you all later.